Good afternoon. To my right are the parents of Nolan Wells, and we'll hear from them. And of course, Attorney of Black America, Ben Crump, and Attorney Park, you'll hear from. I want to let me say at the outset that when I received the word of what happened to Nolan and began hearing what was pieced together, it is clear that this situation must have the most thorough and objective investigation to lead to justice. What we've been told does not make sense.
I mean, it is all relevant, because when you start talking about drowning, I mean, this is a kid who knew how to swim. This is a kid who was in tip-top shape. He was a superior athlete. And so I'm going to get to that in a moment, these glaring contradictions, but to try to say, oh, we're suggesting it was just an accident or drowning, go ahead and move on. Well, they are not accepting it. They are not accepting it.
Why would a black teenager who never went anywhere without his phone end up dead on a remote island, with his phone recovered not by police but his own mother at the house of the friend who owned the boat? And why, when his family's attorney says a video captures him demanding that phone back, does one of the young men who was actually there say the voice on that recording isn't Wells at all? 18-year-old Nolan Wells was last seen alive on Horn Island on July 4th. His phone was not with him when his friends returned to the mainland without him. According to attorney Ben Crump, who represents the Wells family, it is highly unusual for a teenager to be separated from his phone under any circumstances, let alone on a trip to a remote island with no cell service or facilities. What makes this stand out further is who found the device and how. Wells's mother, Christine Wansley, says she used the location tracking app Life 360 to locate the phone herself and traced it to the home of one of the boys who owned the boat that day. Reverend Al Sharpton, who joined the family at a press conference, has also noted that Wells's keys were found in the same circumstances, in the possession of the friends who returned without him. That combination, a missing phone, missing keys, and a mother doing the tracking work before investigators did, is the foundation the rest of this case is built on. In any death investigation, the chain of custody for physical evidence is not a technicality. It is often the difference between evidence holding up in court and evidence being thrown into doubt. When a family member recovers a phone before law enforcement does, defense attorneys down the line could argue the evidence was compromised, even if that was never anyone's intention. Prosecutors, by contrast, would likely argue that the location and timing of the recovery are still facts on the record, regardless of who physically located the device first. Neither of those arguments has actually been made in a courtroom because no charges have been filed and no criminal case currently exists. But the sequence of who touched the phone and when is precisely the kind of detail a defense attorney would raise before it becomes a live issue at trial. And it's notable that USA Herald reported the Jackson County Sheriff's Department has not publicly addressed the phone's chain of custody at all. That silence from law enforcement is itself a fact worth sitting with, because it leaves the family's version of events as the only account currently on record. Authorities have said they believe Wells drowned and have not suspected foul play, according to reporting from the Associated Press. But a final cause of death is still pending, and that gap between an early working theory and a completed forensic conclusion is exactly where the phone becomes legally significant. A drowning theory on its own explains how a body ends up in the water. It does not explain why a phone and a set of keys ended up somewhere else entirely in the hands of the friends who left the island without him. That distinction matters because a cause of death finding and a sequence of events finding are two different legal questions, even though the public tends to treat them as one. The coroner has said there were no immediate signs of physical injury on Wells's body, which is consistent with drowning but does not rule out other explanations, and it says nothing about what happened in the window of time before he entered the water. If investigators are building a timeline that ends in an accidental drowning, that timeline still has to account for how Wells was separated from his phone and keys, when that separation happened, and whether it happened before or after he was last seen. Right now, none of that has been publicly reconciled. This is where the family's objection becomes a legal argument rather than an emotional one. Crump has said his relatives don't accept that his death was an accidental drowning, and Wansley has said the sheriff's early language on that point made her uncomfortable, asking, "Why are we so quick to rush to this?" That's not simply grief talking, it's a specific challenge to sequencing. If the phone and keys were separated from Wells earlier in the day, during whatever dispute the disputed video may have captured, then the drowning becomes the end of a chain of events rather than an isolated accident, and each link in that chain would need its own explanation. If the phone was left behind for an innocent reason, set down on the boat, forgotten in the moment, the drowning theory holds without needing anything further. The sheriff's department itself has left room for that ambiguity. Investigators have said they're looking into reports of an alleged altercation on the island and have specifically asked the public for any photos or videos, particularly those depicting alleged altercations. That request only makes sense if investigators consider it possible that something happened before Wells entered the water, which means the department's own actions suggest the drowning theory is not yet treated internally as a closed, standalone explanation. A drowning that followed an unresolved conflict over a phone is legally distinct from a drowning that occurred with no preceding incident at all, even if the physical cause of death, asphyxiation by water, turns out to be identical in both scenarios. That distinction has real consequences for what comes next. If the final autopsy and any toxicology results confirm a straightforward drowning with no signs of trauma, and if there's no forensic or witness evidence tying the phone dispute to what happened afterward, the case likely ends where the sheriff's early statements suggested it would: an accidental death, however tragic and however contested that word accidental is for the family. But if any evidence connects the argument over the phone to the circumstances immediately before Wells entered the water, the same drowning finding could instead support a case for negligence or something more serious against whoever was involved in that dispute. The cause of death and the story around it are not the same finding, and right now, only one of those two things has been suggested publicly. The other is still what the entire investigation is trying to reconstruct. Crump has said his team obtained video from that day in which a voice can be heard saying, "Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing?" Crump has stated that voice belongs to Wells, telling reporters that other young people present identified it as his. That claim, if accurate, would establish that a dispute over the phone happened at some point on July 4th. But this is exactly where the case becomes legally complicated rather than clear-cut. Trayston Shefford, a friend who was on Horn Island that day, told Rolling Stone that he, not Wells, is the person who can be heard yelling in the video. That is a direct, named, on-the-record contradiction of Crump's identification from someone who was actually there. In a legal proceeding, an eyewitness's own account of what a recording captures typically carries significant weight, which means this dispute is not a minor footnote. It goes directly to whether the video supports the argument the family is making about Wells's final hours. Even setting the identification dispute aside for a moment, it's worth being precise about what the video actually shows. According to Mississippi Today's review, the footage was filmed from a boat and pans to show other boats and a sandbar where people were standing or waiting. It does not show who was speaking to whom, and it does not capture what led up to the exchange or what happened afterward. That is an important legal distinction. A recording that captures a phrase is not the same as a recording that captures an event in context. If the voice is confirmed to be Wells, what the clip would establish is that a disagreement over a phone occurred. What it would not establish on its own is who took the phone, why, and whether that dispute has any connection to how Wells ended up in the water. Any prosecutor working this case would need corroborating testimony or forensic evidence to connect that video to a cause of death, and right now, no such evidence has been made public. Separately from the video, Wansley has said she believes messages were deleted from her son's phone, telling reporters at Friday's press conference that the absence of saved content was particularly concerning because Wells routinely took photos and videos at social gatherings. She has been careful in how she's framed this, saying the family is seeking answers rather than jumping to conclusions. That framing matters because right now this is an allegation based on an absence, the lack of expected content, rather than a forensic finding of actual deletion. No digital forensics report has been made public confirming that anything was removed from the device, and Sheriff John Ledbetter has publicly asked the public to avoid spreading unverified information while the investigation continues. If a forensic examination were to later confirm deletion, the next legal question becomes who had access to the phone and during what window of time, which loops directly back to the custody timeline raised in paragraph 2. If no deletion is ever confirmed, the claim remains a family suspicion rather than admissible evidence of wrongdoing by any specific individual. Crump has said the family's concern is that Mississippi authorities may be investigating the death of a young black man where young white students may be looked at as having some culpability, with less scrutiny than the reverse scenario would receive. That is a claim about how an investigation might unfold, not a claim about what has actually happened in this one so far. The strongest counter to that argument is one Sheriff Ledbetter himself has made. He has said the department is treating this just like we would any other case and has asked the public to extend privacy to the family while investigators work. A statement that, notably, doesn't address the specific process concerns Crump and Sharpton have raised about transparency and the phone. Strip away the competing interpretations, and here is what is verifiably absent from this case as of now. There is no public forensics report on the phone, no confirmed digital extraction results, no final state autopsy report, and no toxicology findings. The independent autopsy, funded by Colin Kaepernick and conducted in Washington, D.C., was expected to produce results separately from the state's process, according to Crump's interview with Don Lemon, but those findings have not been made public in the reporting reviewed here. This matters because every claim about the phone, where it was found, what the video shows, whether content was deleted, currently exists in a zone where it is either disputed, unconfirmed, or both. None of it has yet been tested against a forensics report, and none of it has been weighed by a court because there is no active criminal charge and therefore no evidentiary hearing where any of this has been formally challenged or admitted. Right now, 3 separate claims about the phone exist side by side: where it was physically recovered, what the disputed voice on the video allegedly says, and whether messages were removed from the device. None of them has been confirmed by an official forensic analysis, and the Sheriff's Department has not addressed the chain of custody question publicly at all. That leaves the case at a point where the family's narrative and any official law enforcement account are simply not aligned, not because one side is lying, but because the process that would resolve the conflict, a completed forensic examination of the phone paired with a released investigative report, has not happened yet. What determines whether this becomes a criminal case, a civil case, or neither is exactly that missing forensic step. Until that report exists, everything about the phone remains allegation on one side and silence on the other. Follow this channel for the next update as soon as the forensic findings, the independent autopsy results, or an official statement from the Jackson County Sheriff's Department are released.